Sorry about that. The fire got a little out of hand. Don't worry about it. It's all handled. Today, we're going to be talking about garbage.
We've all been there. You're setting up your brand new video game console, you pop in a game, getting ready to play it, and then...
Where's my gun?
The video game controller. The way that you, the player, interact with the game. Video game controllers come in so many different shapes and sizes. Some good, some bad, some... fine.
This is a very broad topic, and I'm not going to be going into every kind of different controller that there is, so I figured I would just split this up into different parts, and today we were just going to talk about the Nintendo side of things.
They're my favorite video game company, and in my opinion, the most interesting in the business. They've also been at it for the longest, so they have quite a catalog of different controllers. For example, let's start off with the original NES controller. It's a classic, one of, if not the most iconic controller of all time. It changed how games would be standardized and played, and to the average consumer, it was easy to understand and use. It featured the D-pad, which was very clear about four-way directional movement, along with two primary buttons labeled as A and B, both letters being used to denote which was the primary button and which was the secondary. Then two smaller buttons that were more for special functions like pausing or selecting something on a menu. The design of the NES controller is genius and was revolutionary for the time, but the controller itself does have a few issues. Mainly for me, it's those dang corners. It's a rectangular shaped controller with rounded but hard corners that just don't feel great in the hand after a while. It's nothing painful, it's more of a slight annoyance that keeps it from being truly great. Also, I don't know if this is just me, but I wish it would just fill out my hands a little more. When I hold a controller, I like to feel the weight in it and have both my hands around it, but not have them touching each other. However, the A and B buttons are a joy to press and mash. They're just the right amount of clickiness, and I love it. The slight divot in the buttons is also really nice, because it's like your thumb fits right into it. The NES controller is good overall, with just some slight issues here and there, but as a first attempt, it got so much right. But in the action sets of the NES, along with the standard controller, came...
Oh, there it is!
The NES Zapper. A gun for the NES. Yeah, there isn't actually a lot to say about this one, other than the fact that it's only supported about 17 games out of the entire NES library, which consisted of a total of 716 games, which doesn't make it that useful of an accessory. What's really cool about this thing, though, is just how they were able to develop this pointer-like system on something as old as the NES. Try to remember, this is 1984. I remember thinking that the Wii pointer was cool and futuristic as a kid, but back in 1984, this had to have been crazy. Duck Hunt is the game that is the most famous for using it and was a pack-in title for the NES alongside the original Super Mario Bros. Both games showed off the console and their respective controllers, but it was the Super Nintendo that really took things to the next level. Oh my... This is it. This is the perfect controller for 2D gaming. I cannot overstate enough how great this controller is. It takes everything that worked about the NES controller, makes it better, and then fixed everything that didn't work about it. This is far and away a much better controller than the NES one, and honestly might be a perfect controller. Comparing this to a Sega Genesis controller is interesting because the Genesis controller isn't outright bad. It's just fine. It works. For me, it's just way too big and feels like it's using up room for no good reason. Compared to the SNES controller, which feels a lot more compact and it doesn't feel like any room is wasted. It feels a lot more intentionally designed than, 3 buttons in a row. That's not to say I don't like the Genesis controller, I do. I just think there's a lot of weird design decisions compared to the Super Nintendo controller. The new additions of X and Y are also fantastic, and I love the little detail on how A and B are still concave like on the NES, whereas X and Y are convex on the surface, making it easy to distinguish the two sets of buttons from each other. The change from hard edges to a more curved design is great, and makes it just fit in your hand super comfortably. There's also the addition of the top triggers L and R. These feel so natural being where they are, and I feel like the amount of pressure you're supposed to put on them is just perfect. I'm really not trying to hyperbolize here. This is basically a perfect controller. So how does Nintendo follow up a perfect controller?
You f*** it up.
I'm being a bit harsh here. The N64 controller did a lot of innovating, and it deserves some respect. Nowadays, the N64 controller has been the butt of many jokes due to its unique design. Now let's talk about the good first. For one, Nintendo knew that removing the D-pad entirely would be such a stupid decision. So they knew that had to stay. Heck, modern controllers that really don't need to rely on it anymore still have D-pads, so it was a smart choice. No one really talks about this, but the port on the back for accessories was also a really smart choice, because Nintendo was experimenting a lot with this console, and having a port that would really help with installing some accessories was a good idea. Accessories like the Rumble Pack really evolved gaming. It's pretty much a standard for most controllers at this point, so that was a great idea. The analog stick was probably the biggest innovation though. The PS1 had already been out for a while, and the controller only had a D-pad, and controlling a 3D game with a D-pad just sucks. But the N64 introduced the analog stick, which was revolutionary. But why is this in the center of the controller? This controller is plagued with questions just like this. Why 3 prongs? Why are there multiple different ways to hold the controller? Why does it look like this? The N64 controller has quite a lot of issues. Like, even though the control stick was revolutionary, it was clearly a first attempt. The stick is pretty cheap and it's made out of hard plastic, which is not very comfortable for your thumb. That's not even mentioning how stiff the stick can be sometimes. It wears out easily and just really isn't great. But despite those things, I still like the controller. I think it gets a lot more hate than it deserves, and I think there's some quirky charm to it. I mean, try handing this controller to someone who didn't grow up with it. They'll probably have no idea how to hold it. When we move on to the GameCube though, now this was a step up. This was definitely the best controller of that generation. I hate the PS2 controller. It's just too small and it feels really cheap to me. The original Xbox controller was a mess. It was a mess. And then there was the Dreamcast, which was kind of better. It was very memorable, I'll give them that. The GameCube controller, though, just gets so much right. It uses a more rubber-like plastic for the control sticks, so that they're so much more comfortable. The notches around the sticks help refine more precise movement, especially for games like Super Smash Bros. Melee. The analog triggers in the back are really comfortable, and I like the nice click when you press them all the way down. They get a nice springy feel to them. The shape of the controller just fits right in your hand. It's the perfect size and thickness. I also like how the face buttons are in different positions and shapes, so you can't really get them mixed up. Like, you're never going to get A and B confused because of their different sizes. Also, X and Y are on opposite sides of A with unique bean-like shapes. The only problem with the face button placement is playing Super Nintendo games on the system because of the completely different face button structure. Not to mention the D-pad size, like this is unreasonably small. Same can be said for the C-stick. Switching from C buttons to a stick was great, but this stick is just really tiny and it's honestly kind of weird. Especially in a generation where camera movement was much better than on the N64. Also, the only one Z button on the top? That's weird. And even weirder is how the pressure is on the thing. Like, pressing it down for me just isn't very satisfying. A few issues here and there, but honestly, this is one of Nintendo's best controllers, if not the best. Moving on from here though, we have the Wiimote. I'm pretty nostalgic for this controller, as it was my first video game controller I had ever used, and it has a special place in my heart. But nostalgia doesn't blind me with this one. This controller works great sometimes, and other times it is not very good. I mean, as a traditional controller, it sucks. I remember going over to my friend's house who had an Xbox 360 and being incredibly confused by the controller. I thought the Wiimote was normal, whereas in reality, it was the weird one. But what it sets out to do, it does pretty well. It's really easy to understand for a casual audience, and it's a pretty good controller for introducing people to video games. And it's really comfortable to hold in your hand. But it had to be, especially if you're going to be doing this the whole time. I do like the dual purpose of the Wii Remote and how you can turn it over on its side and boom, it's an NES controller. But it's not the most comfortable this way. I feel like the edges on the D-pad are sharper than I would like and kind of hurt the thumb on long playthroughs. With the nunchuck extension though, this is somewhat better. Having a control stick is nice, but it's only one, and I would rather use something more akin to the Wii Pro Controller. But loads of games don't support the Wii Pro Controller due to the necessity of motion controls. Like, oh, I wish I could play Donkey Kong Country Returns with the Wii Pro Controller. That would be great. Oh wait, I can't because I need to shake this dumbass controller in order to slam the ground as Donkey Kong.
Sorry, that one's been building in me for years.
The Wiimote does a lot right, and I think this is basically the best outcome on a controller that was trying to do everything the Wii needed to do. But I do want to point out that it was because of the Wii Remote that a lot of Nintendo games this generation were so linear. Some of this worked perfectly fine, like in Super Mario Galaxy, but sometimes it just would have been better to have a controller with a second stick to help with camera movement. But do you know what does have 2 full-size control sticks? The Wii U gamepad! Ah yes, the Wii U, the butt end of every joke conceived by man. I'll be honest, I have a soft spot for this console, even despite its multitude of problems. Like, the Wii U gamepad is just a problem in itself. It's big, it's clunky, it's unnecessary, and it has no purpose. Its glossy finish makes it look disgusting after using it once. It has a low-resolution screen, it gets dirty from all the touch use, and after having it for a long time, its battery life can be really, really bad. But all that being said, it's really comfortable to hold in my opinion. The dual stick setup is pretty good, and I like the chunky back buttons. They've always felt really good for me to use, and the face buttons feel pretty good as well. It's definitely not very good, and it has so many problems. But in my book, it's alright. It's got a lot of character, and I think that makes up a lot, even though it's not great. And here we are, the Nintendo Switch's Joy-Cons. Now these get a ton of hate now, but I remember when these were just coming out, and to me they were so cool. Detachable controllers that sync up with each other to become a full controller, but then can be turned on the side and used as individual controllers in the style of the NES. Now that's really cool. Back in 2017, and I still think that concept is great. I just think that the quality overall needs to be improved. I'm not going to go into Joy-Con drift. We've all been there and experienced it. It's a terrible thing, and the controllers are small and kind of cheap feeling, and are in no way my preferred controllers to play the Switch with. But I think they're fine. Not very good, but if they were really as horrible as people say they are, I don't think the Switch would have sold as well as it did. I mean, at every opportunity I use my Switch Pro controller, it's my favorite controller ever, and everything just feels perfect to me. Other than the D-pad, I don't know what happened there. It missed inputs like all the time. Taking a look at all these has been nice. Not all of Nintendo's controllers are equal, but every single one of them has been iconic. Honestly, I like this selection a lot. I like the controllers that come in different shapes and sizes. I feel like I have something to say about each and every one of them. I'll get to the PlayStation, Xbox, and Sega console controllers at some point, but I think this was a great starting point.
Well, now that I'm done talking about Nintendo's controllers, Wait. Why do I feel cold? Wait a minute. No. No. No!